Hello everyone, welcome to Sounds from the Studio, brought to you by Contemporary Craft. Contemporary Craft fosters the use of traditional craft materials such as ceramic, fiber, glass, metal, and wood to make art. Our community honors the history and heritage of craft while showcasing modern, exploratory work.
And since our organization is located in Pittsburgh, PA, we decided to bring some of the stories of our exhibiting and studio artists to a broader audience by way of this podcast. I'm Rachel, the Executive Director at Contemporary Craft.
And I'm Camila, podcaster and art enthusiast. We are your hosts for this journey, and there are many ways to keep up with us. You can go to the Facebook page and like it, Contemporary Craft, on Twitter at SCCPGH, Instagram at SCCPGH, or just go to contemporarycraft.org. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. We just ask that you please follow, rate, and review, and also share alike.
At Contemporary Craft, we are excited for the upcoming opening of our Raphael Founders Prize exhibition, Transformation 11 Works in Glass, which will be on view starting September 9th. During the opening reception, we'll be announcing this year's winning artist and 2 honorable mentions. With this presentation of the Transformation series, we will be celebrating more than 2 decades of this prize, which has created an important history showcasing the contribution of emerging and established artists in the field of contemporary craft since 1997. So today on the podcast, we'll be talking with one former Raphael Prize Transformation winner, Linda Swanson, who is a ceramicist.
All right. Welcome, Linda Swanson. We are happy to have you here on Sounds of the Studio. How are you today?
Good, thanks. Very happy to be here. Thank you again for the invitation.
And congratulations for being a past winner, or a continual winner, I'll say, of the Raphael Prize.
Yeah, it was a true honor.
So, Linda, I am very excited and thrilled to be talking with you today because it was such an honor for me to have the opportunity to work with you. As you probably already know, your installation in Transformation 9, that exhibition was totally mesmerizing for me. The work was, I'd almost say, pivotal for me. I've always been a ceramics enthusiast. It's probably what I've studied a little bit more in the craft field than other medium, but you might recall I photographed that work and the transformation, literally, of it in the gallery. And something about capturing those changes weekly challenged me not to just think about clay bodies, but also our environment and the world that we live in. And so maybe we can just start there. Like, can you share with our listeners a little bit about the work that you installed as the Raphael Founders Prize winner for Transformation 9?
Sure. I had originally submitted a piece for the award that was a fired piece, but upon the invitation to exhibit, I was invited to make a raw clay installation to show alongside the fired pieces. And this is the kind of 2 aspects of my ceramic practice. On the one hand, I'm making pieces out of the raw materials, dry clay, salts, the minerals that we use in ceramics that we typically form and then fire, to see some of the changes that happen that usually take place inside the kiln, outside of the kiln. And so it was really a surprise to be invited to do the installation at as part of the show. And it was an opportunity for a very long installation, maybe the longest that I've ever been invited to do. I think it ended up about 6 months long. So there really was a chance to see the way that that the elements were interacting. So what this piece involved was a field of dry clay. And in this piece, I had sifted in some colorants, some kind of natural colorants of iron, both red and black. And actually, I think there was also yellow. And over time, as water was suspended in a membrane up above the field of dry clay, the water would slowly drip down and become absorbed into the clay. And the clay I was using was also a very kind of particular type of of clay that's super absorbent. So it's called bentonite. It's used for a lot of different applications, from lining wells and man-made lakes to waterproofing foundations, because it has this capability of absorbing liquid and then kind of sealing itself off. The bentonite would absorb the water and kind of swell and almost kind of bloom or blossom as it expanded up to about 15 times its own particle size when it absorbs the water. So it's really kind of a dramatic change that takes place without my interacting with it once it's all set up. So it almost appears a little bit alive, which is really kind of interesting observationally. As when I was researching the material, there are these theories about the origin of life on Earth being linked to materials like bentonite clay, or the minerals that they come from.
Yeah, so thank you. Fantastic definition. For people that maybe visually are trying to imagine what that looked like, you had what? It was a large, was that an aluminum sheet or something that
steel.
Steel. And so all of this powdered substance laid on top of it, probably maybe 1 to 2 inches off the ground. So it was very low to the ground plane. It almost felt like a landscape that you were about to embark on with those parachute sacks above it. So I think it was also interesting because it really did start to feel like an environment or a landscape that you almost could become a part of, which of course you weren't allowed to walk on it, but just as you start to imagine it. But it does have a follow-up question for me, and I wonder if we can talk about Iceland for a minute, because prior to COVID, it had actually become a favorite destination of my wife and me. And I know that some of your work references glacial striations, and in particular Iceland. And I can't remember, though, if this work did or not.
Well, it's maybe not a direct reference, but there was a trip that I was fortunate to take as a student. I received a fellowship to go to Iceland to travel. And I was going to look at the way color appeared in the natural landscape, because I was starting to work with these components of incorporating gravity into my work and kind of natural forces. And I wanted to look at kind of naturally occurring colors. And so I went for this purpose to look at the boiling blue mud pots and the psychedelic colored algae and the red kind of almost rainbow rhyolite clays and that kind of things. But what I experienced there was this really profound interaction between water and land, and the way that the water was moving through that landscape, not just with glaciers, melting glaciers as part of just the kind of normal course of events, as well as, kind of global warming kind of expediting those processes, but just water was moving through the landscape just everywhere you looked. There was a lot of rain too, so just the kind of general land was wet a lot of the time, and it just I thought back to the studio and the state of wet clay, and how there was this beautiful change of or changeability in clay, the kind of potential for change when it's wet, and also the changes that we see clay go through in the studio as it dries out. So that was what I came back wanting to work with, were these two aspects of ceramics, clay and or material kind of that comprise the landscape, and water, and to kind of develop some work around the interaction between those.
Yeah, so now that I think about it, I think maybe the disc that you had originally submitted for the exhibition, the large blue with the red, it was kind of crystallized. Maybe that's where I was getting that reference from, more so than the bentonite and the dripping. So thank you.
Yeah, those pieces too kind of come from that original Iceland experience, believe it or not. And often when I'm kind of stuck in the studio, I'll think back to this trip that I had to kind of get some new potential directions. And so the glaze pieces were really thinking about the hot spring pools. And, from Iceland, there are just these gorgeous colors. And we can achieve some of those very similar colors in glazes. And so this is the opportunity that I have when I'm working in a fired situation or a firing situation as opposed to raw clay, in that there's a lot more potential for developing intriguing colors. And so that piece for the Raphael Prize was really this bright, kind of aquatic blue color, but also had black and red. And those were colors in the landscape around some of these hot spring pools in Iceland. They're also colors that are part of, our bodies. And so becomes this kind of relationship between the geologic and the biologic, and that kind of coming through the minerals in ceramics and the minerals that occur both kind of within and outside of us. So making those connections.
Yeah, it seems like you draw, from what I'm seeing on your website, it's like you draw a lot of your inspiration from agriculture and nature and just science, I guess, in general. Is it?
Yeah, I think it's maybe a default of ceramics that if you are, you become maybe more of an alchemist than a scientist per se, because you're using a lot of your sense of the materials, their qualities of the materials, rather than a kind of abstract formulation of the materials, which can be useful at times, but is only useful in relation to this kind of lived experience or direct experience of the materials. So I think also alchemy involves process as well as material, and I think that is also key to the way that I'm working, both, again, in and outside of the kiln, because in the kiln, a lot of times, and it's true for the piece that we keep referring to, I set up the materials and then let the kiln kind of make the ultimate formation of those materials. So this disc started off as like a big kind of crater, a kind of big bowl. And then it was filled with glaze materials. It actually flattened out in the kiln, didn't remain a bowl, kind of went perfectly flat. But then that liquid clay at high temperatures, liquid glaze rather, kind of the liquid glass of the glaze flows and pools in the kind of deep crevices and becomes thin and cracks in the shallow spots. And so it's kind of filling in the way, kind of water fills in a landscape. So yeah, I think there's a lot of affinities between these things.
So what I would like to do is for you to take us back to the first time that you sat down at a pottery wheel, or first time you used a kiln, or, the first time you experienced the making or molding with clay.
That's a really nice moment to think about. And I had, like we all do, a lot of experience with clay and ceramics just from everyday life, especially in my home. There were two maybe experiences that lead up to the one that I'll get to in your question in just a second. And the first is that my mother collected Danish stoneware pottery in the 70s when I was growing up. When we went on a family camping trip nearby, there was a little Danish settlement in California called Solvang. And every year we collected one more piece. So on our dinner table, there was a variety of pottery. None of it matched. And I loved all of that each piece was very unique. Each piece was kind of individually kind of given its character. I loved that. And then in junior high school, my sister had made a coil bowl for me that I ate my cereal out of then every day. And then kind of as I as I ate my cereal, I held it. It was clunky. It was heavy. It was not a very efficient bowl, but I loved feeling in my hand that the feel of the coils that she formed in her hands, and the smoothness of the glaze. And I think those two experiences kind of really brought me to ceramics.
Sure.
And then I tried it out in high school. I was really fortunate to have a wonderful teacher in high school that basically, I think I tried to recreate those stoneware vessels that I had really admired on our table. That was probably the first clay experience. And so I thought I would become a production potter.
Oh, really?
And I eventually went to Japan after undergraduate studies to become a production potter and to learn pottery. Yeah, I was very interested in the handmade, the quality of uniqueness that brought to each piece. And there's a movement in Japan called the Minge movement, a folk art movement that really venerated the handmade. And so that's what I went to kind of go find.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
So how did you go from wanting to be a production potter to really just like this experimentation within a laboratory setting almost? From what I've seen of videos of your studio and whatnot, it has, I mean, to Camila's point of looking at your website, from what I remember prior, it does feel so like exploratory and, science-like. How did you make that transition?
I think that's a good question. When I came back from Japan, I continued studying a little bit to fill out knowledge that I couldn't gain there. I did gain a lot of skill, I think, in working with clay. It's really a beautiful place to be when one loves ceramics. Japan is maybe the heaven for ceramicists. And I started taking some classes at Cal State Long Beach, and the throwing class was full, so I couldn't enroll. And the only class that was open was a slip casting class. It was the last thing that I thought I wanted to do ever, was to make a mold and to repeat the form out of a mold. I had just come from this being infused with the individual handmade object. But what I discovered in that class was these kind of different states of clay becoming, going from liquid to solid, and going from wet to dry, because you see that kind of happening in the mold very quickly. And it was these kinds of moments of change that, I'm ultimately kind of fascinated with, this changing states of matter. And the studio at Cal State Long Beach was really permissive. There was a lot of room for experimentation, and ultimately, I think I felt kind of freed from being required to make a specific form, like a cup or a bowl. I kind of felt liberated from that there. And while I admire pottery so very much, and I think it's an important part of our daily life, of our art world, it just was ultimately not the direction that I pursued. So it was really this kind of freedom, I think, in that studio, and maybe that has partially led to the approach I take as a teacher myself now, to give room for the experimentation. Maybe, classroom's kind of an extension of that, maybe.
Yeah, and that's what I feel like a lot of artists, or a lot of what a lot of art is just kind of allowing the quote unquote mistakes to happen, or just kind of just going with the flow and letting, just to see what comes of this, what happens.
Yeah, it's so true. And in fact, those pieces, like the disc piece, you could probably say it's like a compilation of all the mistakes that you could possibly make in ceramics. It starts off as a bowl form, and it doesn't stay there. It slumps flat. The glaze gets its color from adding too little colorants into it, so they streak out and they don't stay blended in the glaze. The glaze is cracked and crazed, and all the things you could do wrong are the places maybe where you see material kind of how can I put it, exerting itself. So I think maybe why my work seems so different from the kind of direction I started off as, started off in as a production potter, is that I've stepped back quite a lot and allowed the materials to kind of ultimately make the form.
Nice. Well, what do you find more compelling, the material or the process?
I'm not sure that I could separate out those two, because I think the material is, in the ways that I'm using them, are continuously undergoing a process. And when I was beginning to go into doing the kind of more ephemeral and transitory work, I found myself needing kind of an anchor. The work would it would change so much in the studio, it would almost kind of disappear, right? You'd come in the next day and the thing would be not there anymore. As it was, it would be new. And so I felt like the fired work was this way to kind of freeze the moment. And that's maybe what I'm trying to capture in those pieces, is kind of like an instant. And those kind of were pieces that I could kind of refer back to regularly, and that balanced out the pieces that were in process all the time.
That's beautiful. One of the things we talk a lot about at Contemporary Crafts, and if you or anyone else who's listening has already heard our podcast, we kind of ask is, what is the line between art and craft? And I think, certainly when I look at or experience your work, I ask myself, this is work that asks, is there a line? Like, it's clearly art, but it's made and rooted in traditional craft material in some way or another. So I'm just curious, why clay for you? Like, was it those personal relationships that you had with it? Was it that the material did what you were looking to do? Like, of all the things you could have worked with, how did you really land on clay?
It was maybe the early experiences that I described that kind of brought me to clay. But I think that this ever changeability of this material and the endless possibilities in the medium, the endless combinations of materials that make glaze, the endless combinations of natural materials that end up making clay around the world. If you go from one place to another, the clay will be different as it naturally occurs. It cannot be synthesized. It's one of those materials that we only get through natural means. And maybe just from my own personal interest in these questions around our relationship with the natural world and that kind of thing, clay just seemed to really suit that subject matter. And perhaps my training in the medium has just led me to be kind of continually challenged by it. You'd think that perhaps you'd get to know this material and ultimately master it, but it is one that is very slippery, no pun intended, and it is kind of constantly revealing things to you. It's constantly challenging. It's the lack of control in this medium that attracts many people to it, I think. The fact that you can do some things, but you don't do everything in order to ultimately create the piece. There's something really mysterious and wonderful about that.
Yeah, working with clay, it's so frustrating sometimes of like, you can never finish and feel that you know what the outcome is going to be until you open the kiln. You really don't know.
So it's just like this magical little surprise every time you're done, huh?
But it's like
Christmas morning.
So wholly embrace that, which is just, it's fantastic.
Yeah, I think, you kind of develop a humble quality, and you also, it's kind of like the art of prediction as well. So you can kind of estimate. A good friend of mine said there is no such thing as a glaze test, because you ultimately may get something else once you put that same glaze on another piece in another kiln at a different time with
Wow.
different atmospheric conditions and different length of firing, or different person firing it. And depending on the equipment that you use, that influences it as well. So it's a really, I think because there is this level of complication, it's just kind of ever fascinating.
It sounds like my experience with baking. It's which is, it's just kind of one of those things. It's just like, you just never know. Did you find it frustrating in the beginning, like having all of these elements that just could go awry, like all these variables?
That's interesting. I think maybe there's just a lot of excitement at the beginning. So, when you do get something out that surprises you, it's just really exciting. I think maybe it's more frustrating the more you go on, because
Gotcha.
you think you should know how it's going to work, or, oh, I should have remembered that.
Right.
And so that's what's frustrating.
But when was it that you accepted that you're an artist?
Maybe I didn't adopt the title artist for a long time, and I maybe thought of myself as a maker. I liked making things. So yeah, I'm not sure of the exact moment. That's a really good question. But there was a moment that I described earlier of kind of feeling liberated from a particular form linked to pottery. And that's maybe the moment that I thought, maybe I'm not a potter and I'm an artist. But I think maybe those two terms are also interchangeable.
Right.
So
yeah. It's just sometimes a lot of people have this heavy notion surrounded with the word artist. Like it just kind of it feels heavier and more defined than anything else. That's at least my own personal experience with it. It's like it took me years to go ahead and accept and feel comfortable calling myself an artist in public or in mixed company. Do you recall your first exhibit?
Well, it was in Japan, and I had joined some pottery studios. I didn't apprentice as a traditional apprentice in Japan, because as a foreigner, it's quite difficult to do that, let alone being a woman at that point in time in the early 90s. So I was a part of several studios, and I also joined a weaving studio because I also have a background growing up sewing, and in some of my installations, I'm also incorporating fibers and materials. And I joined a hand weaving studio, and we did a pit firing out in a field in Japan. And then those pieces were exhibited at the gallery in the studio in conjunction with the weaving studio. So that was the first one.
What were you extremely nervous about it?
It was a group show, so It was really celebratory.
Gotcha.
Not too much pressure, I suppose.
So kind of different, but in the vein of like how things started and how you've come to where you are, have you had any mentors in the field? And if so, why do you consider those individuals to be a mentor?
Well, ceramics maybe is one of the most community-oriented media, I think. We are often in groups working around equipment that is expensive to set up by oneself. And I ended up, I think, in a lot of different educational settings to have studio access and just to learn more, because there's just a kind of ongoing process in ceramics too. There's just a lot to know. And when I returned from Japan, I landed at Cal State Long Beach, and I think maybe my most kind of important mentor that maybe set the conditions, in a sense, for my future was Tony Marsh at Cal State Long Beach, who had created a program there that just was full of potential. And I think I got there at a moment when he also had a lot of experience himself as an artist and a educator, and in very small, kind of quiet moments, gave me encouragement and challenges that really were important. And I think still today, I ran into him at an NCCA a few years ago, and still he's challenging me with my work. Not, no pats on the back, right? Just and what about this?
Right.
So I think that's a mentor for life. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. One who just continually pushes you to go out and do one more step. Let's see what you do.
But there's been so many important people, and also a lot of important women in our field that have been, models for me. Kristen Morgan, and also a teacher at Long Beach. Andrea Gill, one of my instructors in graduate school. Kim Dickey, who was a visiting artist while I was an undergrad, and also just these models of women living the life of an artist. I think that has been important to see.
Yeah, I think that that's very helpful for anyone who is even considering to go into that realm. It's to see someone actually living it, and just what that looks like, being able to visualize Absolutely. It. Of all of your pieces, if you can, which one would you find? Which one of the most exciting for you? In just in the end, or the journey to it, or the creation of it?
That's a really good question. There was a piece that was a precursor to the one at Contemporary Craft, and this was at the Milwaukee Art Museum, which is a incredible space designed by Santiago Calatrava, which is we were in a hallway that it was not kind of like an ordinary hallway. It was kind of like a belly of a whale. It was along the ocean, along the lake. Sorry about that. We're in Milwaukee. And the supports on the museum were like these ribs, as they're described in architecture too, using the kind of vocabulary of the body.
Wow.
And really dramatic architecture that I could then work with in terms of an installation. So where this architecture was feeling very much like a kind of like a whale skeleton, then my installation was kind of like these inserted the kind of processes, or kind of related maybe to the processes of the body inside that space. So it was really a dramatic space, really exciting to respond to that architecture, which is part of the task in installation, is to try to integrate the work into the situation where it is, so it feels like it's part and parcel with the space.
Yeah, I'm sure that can be extremely challenging, but a lot of times, I'm sure most of the time it's absolutely worth it, because it's you got this brand new canvas sort of, and it's just see what happens. We kind of practice in the studio, but then when you get to the site, it's brand new for me, just like it is everyone who is around me helping with these installations, which
is an important part of the process that wasn't something that I foresaw with installation, that it's not just, or at least the scale that I've been working at, is not just me who's involved. It's a whole team. And it was the same at Contemporary Craft. There were lots of the staff and relatives of the staff who came in and helped, and getting to know everyone there and to work together for the common, kind of purpose is really a beautiful part of the process for me. And it's not one that I planned, but it's definitely been a benefit of the whole thing.
Linda, I know that Camila has another question for you. It's like our standard question, but as we're wrapping up, I do just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. It's always a joy, and I really appreciate hearing more about your process, and hope that there's another opportunity for us to work together in the future. So thank you.
I hope so too. My time at Contemporary Craft was a definite highlight for me.
Well, before I get to the standard question, I also had another question that just came to me. I was
sorry. I didn't mean to rush you.
Totally fine. Just out of curiosity, what are you working on currently? Is there anything or that you can talk about? Or, some people like to keep it under wraps.
Yeah. Phones are firing downstairs right now. I'm working for a show here in Montreal at La Guilde Gallery. And that's happening in September. It's a series of discs again, but they're quite different. They're a different series of glazes called oil spot glazes, which are made with iron. And the iron kind of is applied in layers. And as the glazes boil or kind of bubble in the kiln, the lower layers kind of seep up through the upper layers and create these kind of oil spots in the surface. So they, in a way, they look kind of like galaxial, kind of like stars in the sky or something like that.
That's amazing. I find your work and your process and you extremely interesting. I look forward to seeing it in person someday soon. So, to our standard question, and hopefully, I believe that Rachel sent this to you beforehand. We like to ask our artists, what are the 3 songs that you would pick to describe your work? And this is always a fun time.
This is a fun question. Maybe I'm going to hearken a little bit to your experience in the kitchen and mention that there's a lot of analogies with cooking and ceramics. So the first song I might say is Soup by E.C. Wood. Again, there's lots of food metaphors in ceramics, and it's just a really fun song. So,
nice.
So there's one. Maybe the next one would be Gooey by Glass Animals. In this song, and these songs are actually, a lot about relationships and that kind of thing. It's maybe not that aspect that's so linked to my work, but there's this reference to an icy gooey womb and or icky gooey womb rather, not icy, and that kind of like body quality that we were talking about earlier with the biology. That's kind of, it's both kind of maybe repulsive, but also fascinating and mesmerizing. That's kind of the idea there with that one. And then the last tangential connection with my work would be Bug Collector by Haley Hendricks. And that maybe is a little bit more obscure because we didn't talk about this at all, but there's maybe a series of works that I've been doing that's more kind of oriented towards public art. And it involves making little ceramic insects.
Really?
So made a series of cockroaches, made a series of slugs, these kinds of insects that maybe usually really repulse us, and try to make them as, gorgeous and irresistible with crystalline glazes and redeem them a little bit and just kind of remind us how important every tiny bit of our ecosystem is ultimately. And so those little figures kind of are something easy maybe to relate to. And so they are these works that end up in a bit more kind of public venues.
So I did see that, right? Like on your website, I'm looking at Quantum Bloom. Are those the cockroaches in which you speak of?
They are. The bugs themselves.
Was there a lot of real life study that you had to do with the bugs and stuff? Like,
I did, because I just started.
And there is a follow-up question. I'm sorry. Bugs are just like, that's not my. This is fascinating to me. Like.
I've gotten lots of, kind of like confessionals from folks who actually really love cockroaches, and then some who, they're kind of traumatic stories with them. So again, there's this aspect to the work that ends up being very communal somehow, even though it's centered around these objects. So, I did go to natural history museums and study, bugs to kind of understand their anatomy. Photographs didn't quite work to make make them dimensionally. So they're not any specific exact bug,
but we get the point, basically, is what you're saying. Like the public, we get it. We get what's in there.
There was one viewer who walked in the gallery, jumped 5 feet in the air, screamed, and ran out.
That is me.
That maybe this was. Was that you?
That is me.
So they did maybe kind of, they were covered in salt water, so they were really wet and kind of glistening in the light. So they might have looked like they were kind of moving, a little bit of movement or something. But
wow,
I didn't have the real ones there.
And you said this is also part of a public arts, a public art pieces or public artworks.
Yeah, there's been a chance to, and even recently this summer out in the countryside in Quebec, to set them out in kind of outdoor spaces, outdoor urban spaces as well. Wow. And kind of relate to histories of sites and draw attention to, these ideas that are percolating in the work about transformation and that kind of thing.
Well, holy cats. Well, thank you, Linda, for taking us on this journey. This has been very educational and inspirational. Thank you so much for taking the time.
It's been a pleasure, and I hope to see all of you at Contemporary Craft before too long.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Linda.
Okay, make sure you all join us for our next episode. During the next episode, we'll be talking with the Transformation 11 Works in Glass Raphael Prize winner. But because that person isn't announced yet, you will have to wait and see. You'll tune in and listen and learn and enjoy another story and journey with another wonderful artist.